Jody Edna wrote the piece, How the Clinton Testimony May Change the Nation. She says while the investigation of the president's alleged peccadillos is widely perceived as being far less serious than Richard Nixon's Watergate scandal, it does have the potential to transform the nature of the presidency and the relationship among the president, the courts, and Congress. This is what the headline looks like this morning on the front page of USA Today. A new survey out says the public is ready for the truth. And this morning, a story that we'll be spending a fair amount of time talking about is on the front page of the New York Times. It's also on the front page of the Baltimore Sun from the New York Times wire service, and it's this headline: the president weighs admitting he had sexual contacts. The story, which was written by James Bennett and Richard Burke, Neil Lewis, and others for the New York Times, says, quote, Mr. Clinton would say he based his previous denial in a deposition in the Paula Corbin Jones lawsuit on a definition of sex approved by the judge in the case. His advisors believe this definition does not cover certain activities, including oral sex. Gary Webb, on that note, good morning to you.
Thanks. That's a fine note.
What do you make of this?
I think this is the most bizarre story I've ever seen. I mean, this is going into definitions of sex now. And to have the president be questioned about what he thinks sex is just astonishing to me. I mean, you read the definition in the New York Times, and we're getting down to things like touching genitalia and touching anuses and things like that. And I'm sorry, I'm glad I hadn't had breakfast yet before I read that story.
Let me continue. An acknowledgement of some kind of sexual encounter poses considerable risk, particularly if it were linked to a legal argument that rests on the narrow definition of sex. The New York Times goes on to say this morning, but Mr. Clinton's advisors have said it poses a greater risk to tell anything less than the truth to a grand jury about sex with Ms. Lewinsky. It is not clear how precisely Mr. Clinton has described his relationship with Ms. Lewinsky to his lawyers. My question to you is, how does the New York Times get this information? Who's talking?
It's the same way that the Washington Post gets the information. If you look at the Washington Post story, it's a very similar story. And the people that are talking, obviously, are the people that are close to Clinton. The question you have to ask yourself when you see a story like this is this real, or is this a trial balloon that's being floated now to see how the public's going to react to it? And this has the earmarks to me of a trial balloon. I think people are trying to see how the public's going to react to the president saying, well, I may have had oral sex, but I don't consider that to be sexual contact.
Before this program began, I was going to ask you why this story is not on the front page of the Washington Post. The early edition does not have it on the front page, but the later editions has this story by Peter Baker that says, counseling a narrow admission of sex. Based on that, could you assume that the Washington Post received this after the first deadline of its early publication?
No, what I would suspect is that people saw the way the New York Times played it and remade the front page to put their story on the front page as well.
We'll be talking with Gary Webb for the next hour and also discussing his latest book called Dark Alliances. But first, Garden Grove, California, on our liberal line. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What are you reading today?
The LA Times.
And do you have a copy of it in front of you? Is it? I know it's early.
No, it's in the other room. But I'm calling in regarding the upcoming testimony in the Clinton-Lewinsky matter. And I don't know, I mean, I've seen the tenor of the news sort of change in the last couple of days, and suddenly people are talking about, oh, this is getting real serious, and et cetera, et cetera. And the president hasn't changed his stance. And I think, you know, it's turning into a big showdown, and Clinton is heading right into it. I think the pressure is really starting to come down on Starr now. I mean, if Clinton really didn't have a relationship with this woman, I mean, it's going to be just a tremendous in-your-face political victory for Clinton. I mean, it's going to put this entire political charade on the center showcase. And even if he did, it should be a pretty simple thing for him to defuse. And after everything that we saw, starting with Quayle and then Rush Limbaugh, and all the tremendous political attacks and everything, it just cracks me up that here we are in 1998, and the biggest feather in the Republican cap is this little sex scandal that they have going with Clinton.
Thanks, caller. We'll get another view from Little Rock, Arkansas, on our conservative line, reading the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. Good morning.
Good morning. I love C-SPAN, sir. This morning in our paper, we have an editorial by Meredith Oakley where she samples some of the opinions from different states concerning Hillary Clinton's statement that Clinton's troubles, the president's troubles, is because of an anti-Arkansas bias. I am so steamed today that she would say that about our state. I mean, it just appears to me that, you know, that that they're unraveling up there about how to treat this problem with his not telling the truth to the American people. It has nothing to do with an anti-Arkansas bias. It has to do, I think, with the failure to just come out and level with the American people. And I'd like to ask your guest what he thinks about it.
And let me also point out, Jill Lawrence has a piece this morning, the headline in USA Today, Hillary Clinton, public fighter, private mystery.
Well, I think the most significant story in the last couple of days has been the admission by the Star people that their final report may have absolutely nothing to do with Whitewater. To me, that was the idea behind this whole special prosecutor argument, was that we were going to get into Whitewater and find out what went down there. And now it's going to be limited to Monica Lewinsky, which tells me that there was nothing behind Whitewater if he's got nothing to bring forward to Congress, to bring forward to courts. And I think it's sort of a sad comment that we spent all this money and all this time, and all we've got is, like the caller said, a tawdry little sex scandal. I just don't think the American public's all that interested in what the president does with his private life. I'm sorry. I mean, I know it's on the front page of all the newspapers, but I don't sense from talking to people that they give a damn one way or another.
USA Today says the public is ready for the truth. Here's how the story begins. Americans want President Clinton to tell the truth when he testifies Monday to a grand jury, even if it means admitting that he had a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky. The poll suggests trouble for Clinton if he commits perjury Monday. If that can be proven, 3/5 of those surveyed by USA Today said it would be serious enough for them to consider him removing from office. We got a call from Fort Lauderdale. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for taking my call. I just wanted to talk about the Swiss banking settlement, and I think that's great that they finally owed up to their mistakes, but I'd like to see our politicians put pressure on the Swiss banks to quit being the bankers for the international terrorist and drug dealers. Supposedly this guy that blew up the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania is some billionaire from Saudi Arabia. I wonder where that guy keeps his money, probably in the Cayman Islands or Swiss or the whole host of these other banks. And I wish there was some pressure on to clean up the banking system, and all these terrorists and drug dealers wouldn't have any place to put their money.
There's a story on the front page below the fold in the Washington edition of the LA Times that profiles the Saudi dissident who you referred to, Hossami bin Laden. He is, his father had 52 children from a number of different wives. He is worth several $100 million, according to Robin Wright, who wrote the piece for the LA Times. And she profiles how he turned against the Americans essentially as a result of Operation Desert Storm in 1990.
Well, you know, there was a very interesting book written a couple of years ago by a journalist named Jonathan Whitney. It was called Endless Enemies. And his theory was that the United States foreign policy simply creates enemies wherever we go. And I think this is another example. When we intervene in the affairs of other countries and we shoot at people and people get shot at with American bullets and American weapons, we create enemies. And if this is true, that this man turned against the United States government as a result of Desert Storm, we've created another enemy there we might not have had before.
Two things related to this. An editorial cartoon in the Washington Times has a caricature of President Clinton. Hello, Saddam. What you doing this Sunday? And the headline in front of him, President to testify on Monday. What do you make of that? What's your reaction?
Well, it's the old wag the dog story. You know, you get in trouble, you start a war. And that's the way I read that cartoon.
And the New York Times editorial this morning, Saddam Hussein makes his move. The editors of the paper say two international inspectors who know the most about Iraq's efforts to create new weapons of mass destruction have raised an alarm that President Clinton and other world leaders must not ignore. The editorial concludes that he, the president, must not let these and other matters prevent him from dealing firmly with a crisis in Iraq that grows more dangerous by the day.
Yeah, and there was another story you were going to talk about a little later along those similar lines about the problems in Russia that are sort of being diverted and swept under the rug while we concentrate on whether or not oral sex is sex. I think it's an excellent point.
Michael McFaul, who is a fellow at the Hoover Institution and also a professor at Stanford, has a piece this morning. It's called Perspective on Russia. It's on the op-ed page of the LA Times. The headline is, "Forget about Monaco, it's Moscow, and the stakes are global." Let me just read you 2 or 3 sentences from the piece. He writes, quote, "By this time, Russia very well may be down the throes of a major market meltdown, which in turn might trigger political upheaval on a scale similar to Indonesia. Different from Indonesia, however, Russia still has 10,000 nuclear weapons. The gravity of Russia's crisis makes this September summit one of the most important foreign policy missions of the Clinton presidency and an event of much greater importance than his grand jury testimony." By the way, there's a story on the front page of most newspapers about the financial situation and Boris Yeltsin, who as of now is saying that he is not going to devalue the ruble. Michael McPhail concludes this morning in the LA Times by saying, "No one has greater interest in promoting the consolidation of democracy and capitalism in Russia than Bill Clinton. If Russia eventually succeeds in becoming a member of the international community of democratic states, President Clinton will secure his place in history as an important foreign policy president."
Yeah, and that's the point I made earlier. There are a lot more important things going on around the world that we're reading nothing about because the news media is consumed with this Monaco story.
And this is Michael Wine's piece. Just a quick headline. "Stock and bond prices drop in Russia as investors bolt." Stock and bond prices plunged today, jarring Russia's hopes that the government could avert a depletion of its finances and a meltdown of Russia's banking system. Back to your phone calls. Santa Fe, New Mexico on our moderate line. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I'm calling regarding Monica Lewinsky, and I just find it very interesting that this dress that she supposedly turned in to for DNA, she has kept for 2.5 years. Why would anybody in their normal right mind keep a dress that for that period of time without even washing it? I mean, I just look at all these little circumstances. I find it very interesting in your book, Dark Alliance. I'm curious in your thoughts, possibly. I know it's pretty basic, but I think it brings up some fundamental questions.
Gary Webb.
Well, I think it's interesting now that the dress is resurfaced and now that it's in the hands of the FBI, we're seeing stories in the paper about how Clinton is weighing whether or not to admit a relationship with Lewinsky. I don't think you can conclude that they're unrelated. I think there might be something to that. And you know, I think most Americans, like that USA Today poll said, if it happened, tell us about it and let's get on with it.
Roxanne Roberts of the Washington Post on the Styles section this morning. Yuck. The scandal that's taken the romance out of sex.
That's, yeah, read the New York Times story this morning. If you want to talk about taking the romance out of sex, read the definition of sexual relations in the New York Times this morning.
We will let them read it. We're not going to talk about it.
That's exactly my point.
But let me read you what Roxanne Roberts said. The consensus is in, this is a bad sex scandal. Please, God, let this all be over soon. Morality aside, this sex scandal, and it is a sex scandal despite all the rhetoric about obstruction of justice and suborning perjury, is nothing but an unseemly embarrassment to the presidency, to women, and to sex itself. What kind of man allegedly calculates his tryst to conform to a legal definition of technical fidelity? And what kind of woman keeps a stained dress as a souvenir, then gives it to her mother? The public is disgusted, the media embarrassed, and sophisticated adults at a loss for polite discourse, says one woman who was active on Washington's dinner party circuit.
Well, you know, the thing that's funny is that a number of years ago, we in the American press used to make fun of the English press for concentrating on these sex scandals. And, you know, because the British tabloids have been full of this kind of stuff for years. And I'm not sure that, you know, the fact that Rupert Murdoch has come in and bought a lot of companies, and we now have a lot of English journalists over here practicing in our profession, that this is an outgrowth of that. I mean, English politics has been based on sex scandals for many, many years, and we used to be above that in American journalism. Now that's what we are.
Sturgis, Michigan, good morning on our conservative line.
Good morning. I would like to know why last night on MSNBC there was they read a letter from a Democratic senator, I think he was from Georgia, that was asking the president to resign before he tears the country up. And I have heard nothing on any of the other stations. And may I say one thing? These people that write in and say that, call in and say they don't know why she kept the dress. She knew Bill Clinton, and she knew what he was going to try to do to her, and that was the only evidence she had. And I think this man is a habitual liar, and he should be tried for treason. Thank you.
Thanks for that call from our conservative line. We'll get one more view on our liberal line from Chicago, reading the Sun-Times. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. How are you, Mr. Webb?
I'm all right.
The headline for us on the Sun-Times is Young Suspects Go Home. That's about the 2 young boys involved in the killing of the 11-year-old girl. That's an important story, but I want to, since you're on this morning, Mr. Webb, I want to talk about how a lot of what's in the media correlates to what I think that happened to you and your story that ran in the Mercury News. When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, they were telling us, well, don't trust government, and to be suspect of what the government tells you. And I think that now we've gone beyond there to where now we can't trust all the time what the media is telling us. It seems that there's reason to question if the media is being dupes of some power who wants to manipulate what the public thinks. Your story that ran in the Mercury News, they totally went out to try to discredit you. And I didn't believe it when they did it. I know what you were saying in your story, and they accused you of saying that the CIA was selling drugs, which I don't believe that's what your story was saying. But this is the way that they went about discrediting you so that your story wouldn't have life, and it was an important story.
Thanks, caller. I'm going to stop you there because we're going to spend a couple of minutes next talking about this book and his background in San Jose. But you brought up the earlier point about the headline of the Sun-Times on the case involving a 7- and 8-year-old boy, and I just want to give him an opportunity to respond to that, and then we'll talk about his book.
That is really a tragedy. I mean, I have never seen a case, and I don't think anybody else has, of 2 children. I mean, these are infants basically killing a girl. I think it's a sign of the times. I think it's a very sad sign of the times when you've got children killing other children now.
And the previous caller from Michigan said that she knew exactly why Monica Lewinsky kept the dress. Did you want to respond to that?
Boy, I don't know why. I don't know why at all.
Our guest is Gary Webb. He is the author of this book called Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion. What led to this?
I had been covering the drug war for the Mercury News for a number of years, and this was an outgrowth of a story that I had done about the state of California's asset forfeiture program, which is a program where if the police believed you were a drug dealer, they could come in and take your house and your car and your money without even charging you with a crime. And I had been doing stories on that, and a young lady in Oakland had read one of them and called me up and put me onto a story about her boyfriend, who was an accused cocaine trafficker who had that happen to him. He had his property taken away.
Danilo Blandon?
His name was Rafael Cornejo. It turned out that the key witness against him for the federal government was this fellow, Danilo Blandon, who had been a leader of the Contras in California in the early 1980s and had been a huge cocaine trafficker in his own right. And when I got into investigating her boyfriend's case, I came across Blandon, and I came across his involvement with the Contras and his involvement ultimately with a major crack wholesaler in Los Angeles named Freeway Ricky Ross. And so I did a series that said that the crack market in South Central Los Angeles had been created in the early 1980s with the help of this Contra drug ring, and showed how once crack got hold in South Central and once the gangs got a hold of it, it was spread from South Central to other cities in the United States. And it ended up being a huge controversy.
You begin by talking about the Somoza family and the allegiance that the family in Nicaragua, the ruling family, had with the U.S. government for more than 40 years.
Right.
And then you write that the Americans wanted him to disappear. What happened?
Well, he became an embarrassment to the American government. His army, the National Guard, was committing human rights abuses. And remember, this was during the Carter era, and human rights were big on our agenda at that time. And so they came to him and said, this has gotten out of hand. You need to step aside. We need somebody else to take over. And at that point, they were still trying to salvage the American government's relationship with Nicaragua. Obviously, at that point, it was too late. And the Sandinistas came in and threw everybody out. And what happened was a lot of the men close to Somoza, a lot of the men from his army came to the United States because we had been allies with them for a long time. And among this flood of political exiles were these two major cocaine traffickers who set up a drug ring along the West Coast and dealt tons of cocaine in the United States for many, many years while the U.S. government was aware of it.
So connect the events that began with this and then led to the series in the San Jose Mercury News, and you write about Howard Kurtz of the Washington Post, who you had a conversation with, claiming that the Mercury News was trying to suppress the story or parts of the story.
This was afterwards. After the series came out, my story and myself were attacked by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the LA Times for drawing conclusions that were unwarranted, essentially. And after the counterattacks and the media started, the Mercury News sent me back down to Central America. My partner George Hodel and I wrote another series of stories that essentially took the knowledge of this drug ring even further in the United States government. The Mercury did not print those stories, and Howard Kurtz called me up, and I mentioned to him that there were additional stories that we had written that the Mercury News was suppressing, and he did a column about it in the Washington Post.
Why did they suppress it?
At that point, you know, they had been beaten up for about 9 months by the mainstream media, and at that point, the decision was made: either we go forward with this story and we get beaten up some more, or we back off of the story and it goes away. And what they decided to do was back off of it and go, and you know, similar to what happened with the CNN Tailwind story. Pursuing it would have created a huge controversy. Backing away from it created a minor controversy at the time, and now the story's gone. It's off the radar screen.
So who's the Dark Alliance with?
The Dark Alliance referred to the allegiance between these Contra drug traffickers and the gangs of Los Angeles, who were their main customers.
And who are the Contras?
The Contras were former Somoza supporters, former Somoza military officers who had been kicked out of Nicaragua in 1979 and were trying to retake the country with the aid of the CIA. And the one thing that's important, and a lot of people don't recall because this is ancient history, you know, it happened 15 years ago, was that the Contras were a creation of the CIA. And so when our story came out saying that the Contras were dealing drugs in Los Angeles and elsewhere, and that these drug traffickers were meeting with CIA agents, a lot of people took that to say the CIA created the crack epidemic, which is clearly not the case. And I spent a great deal of time in the book talking about how crack was on its way at the time this happened. But the impact of it was that when you had all this cheap cocaine going into South Central Los Angeles, right at the time people were figuring out how to take this powder cocaine and turn it into crack, you had sort of a collision of historical events in a very odd place. And what happened from that was you had a spread of crack nationwide because the gangs spread nationwide. The gangs, after the LA market got saturated, took this to other cities and set up crack markets in other cities that didn't have them.
What led to your departure at the San Jose Mercury News?
Well, a number of things. The fact that the Mercury News backed off the story. I mean, I had worked a year on this. I had been an investigative reporter for them for 9 years, done a lot of major investigations for them, and you know, I had a very good reputation at that newspaper. The fact that they would back off the series because they were being criticized by other newspapers, I found very disheartening. And then I was taken off the story when I believed the story had only been half told. So one of the reasons I quit was to write this book and finish telling the story, because I think this is an important part of our history that had been denied us for a long time.
The book is called Dark Alliance by Gary Webb. It is published by 7 Stories Press in New York. There's an article in the latest edition of Esquire, the September edition, with the headline, The Pariah. Have you ever been called that before?
I've been called a lot of things before, but never a pariah, although in this case I think it's meant ironically.
Charles Bowden wrote the piece 2 years ago. Gary Webb wrote a series of articles that said some bad things about the CIA and drug traffickers. The CIA denied the charges, and every major newspaper in the country took the agency's word for it.
True. True, and that was the strange part about it, is that we laid out a series based on a year of investigation that had buku government documents. Most of the series is based on government documents, DEA reports, FBI reports, the testimony of government witnesses. And the other papers came back with unnamed sources, mostly unnamed government sources, saying, well, this couldn't be, we don't believe it, these drug traffickers weren't as significant as Webb made out. And that was it. And at that point, the series was viewed as discredited because unnamed government sources told the Washington Post that they didn't believe it. So, you know, I think this is an interesting lesson for the press. And I think what you've seen as a result is the sort of CNN tailwind fallout now that investigating covert CIA operations, investigating the CIA in general, is now off limits to the press unless you have what Ted Turner called proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which when you're talking about covert operations, you're never going to find as a journalist.
So from where you sit, who was telling the truth? CNN, the producers who were fired or let go, or the CIA?
I think that it's still an open question. I don't think the issue was solved at all, but the debate is over with. I mean, the tragedy of that CNN tailwind story is I think they had a good story. I think there was a lot of evidence to suggest that this occurred. The problem is when you retract it, it buries it forever. Nobody's going to look at it. And the issue is like radioactive now, and nobody will touch it again, and we'll never know the truth. I mean, if it's not true, there's ways to find that out. And I think the CNN story was significant enough to warrant congressional hearings. I mean, if you've got incidents of nerve gas being used against American defectors, that's something Congress should be looking at.
What are you doing these days?
I'm working for the California legislature investigating government agencies. I work for the Task Force on Government Oversight.
Could you see yourself working for a newspaper again?
I liked writing the book real well. I would like to keep writing books.
Back to your calls with Gary Webb of Dark Alliance, Meredith, New Hampshire. Good morning. Thanks for waiting.
Oh my gosh, I've waited a long time.
We're glad to hear from you. We want to talk a little bit about this book so that our viewers have some background on our guest.
Well, I realized it was interesting, too. I want to make a comment, and then I want to ask this man a question. My comment is, one person has called in, and then you quote an article where they say, what kind of a woman would save this dress? But the point is, what kind of a president would get himself involved with a woman who would save this dress? What kind of president would put his whole future in the hands of this dumb adolescent nitwit from California? I think this, I'm being very serious. This president needs a psychiatrist. He is, I don't understand a man who's been wanting to be president since he's in high school, supposedly. And then he lets this girl come in. Even more important, what kind of staff does he have that lets him do this? It reminds me a little bit, not to the same degree, but of Hitler in his bunker, and he didn't have one person who could tell him the truth, that the war was lost. Doesn't he have anybody around him that can look him in the eye and say, go get counseling, Mr. President. You're in trouble here.
Thanks.
Now, the question I want to
Sure.
ask is, you made a flat statement, more or less flat, that this report is going to be only about sex. You don't know any more about that than I do. That the Star report is going to only be about this. You haven't got a clue about that when you make that statement.
No, it was in the newspapers a couple of days ago that the report was not going to deal with Whitewater. It was going to deal primarily with the Lewinsky case and obstruction of justice and that sort of thing.
The president will testify Monday for about 5 to 7 hours in the White House. When do you think we'll hear the first reports of what he said?
A couple of hours. That's how fast things leak anymore.
Carabel, Florida is next. Good morning on our conservative line.
Good morning. Good morning to you. First of all, let me tell you how much we enjoy C-SPAN.
Well, we appreciate you watching.
It's a breath of fresh air with some of the things that we see. And I'm kind of changing pace this morning with an article by Kathleen Parker entitled Families of Switch Babies Act Nobly. She starts out by saying, every now and then someone comes along to restore faith in humanity. A round of hosannas, please, for the families of 2 babies switched at birth. She goes on to say how the families met without attorneys and judges to complicate things, and how well they handled things and how amicable things have gone, and hopes that they are not pressured by attorneys to change this. So it's kind of a pleasant thing to be able to read people getting along together. My opinion of attorneys continually diminishes, and it seems to me that they cost us a lot of money.
Caller, if you have access to a website, the Washington Post in its Metro section, and I don't have it in front of me, unfortunately, has a piece looking at the 5-hour window that they think the babies might have been inadvertently switched, and both the families in the hospital are now saying that it was an accident. There's also a half-page ad in the Washington Post by the president of the University of Virginia Medical Center admitting that there needs to be corrections in the way these babies are watched in the nursery as they arrive, and as a matter of fact, I have it right here in front of me. So it's in the Metro section of the Washington Post. The headline is, "Baby's Mother Zeroes In on the Time That the Switch Could Have Occurred."
And I think that's fine. The thing that I found interesting about Kathleen Parker's story about it was not necessarily the rather bizarre details that might have taken place, but the idea that people can act independently and responsibly without always having a commissioned attorney around. Which seems to me to cause all of us a great deal of inflation in our expenses that we all have to participate in. I think we need a few less attorneys and a little bit more common sense.
Thank you, caller from Carabel, Florida. Are you an attorney?
No, I'm happy to say my brother is, however.
We'll get a call from Decatur, Texas on our liberal line, reading the Times and Record. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling about a article. It's called "Pentagon Says Army Should Have Charged for Services." This is by Jim Abrams, Associated Press. And it's an article. It says, "Preparing for the Republican takeover of Congress in 95, it says here, but it was 94. Newt Gingrich dispatched top aides and lawmakers to the Army for sessions of military strategy. Now the Pentagon says the Army inappropriately provided the services without charges of politicians. Several days before the Republicans swept into power, soon-to-be House Speaker Gingrich, a self-styled military brat whose stepfather was a career Army officer, sent his Chief of Staff Dan Meyer and other aides to the Army Training and Doctrine Command, TRADOC, at Fort Monroe, Virginia, for a briefing on organizational design. And over the next year, other visits followed in which Gingrich's aides and GOP lawmakers attended seminars on information, management, strategic thinking, the art of battle decision-making. Gingrich made 3 personal visits to Fort Monroe in 93, 95, 97 for briefings on subjects of lessons learned in Somalia, warfighting concepts, the Army's future.
This is an Associated Press story, caller?
Yes.
And it's in your paper this morning?
It is.
Gary Webb, why would something like that appear now? Any idea?
Somebody got a tip. I mean, that's the most likely explanation. Somebody got a tip about it. I'm still not sure I understand the point of it. It's that the Army should have charged Gingrich for these lessons? Is that the...
Caller, you have the story in front of you. Is that the headline?
Pentagon says Army should have charged for service. Now, this is where they...
Is this based on an audit?
Huh?
Is this based on an audit? A Pentagon audit?
It is a whole article. It's Jim Abrams. It says, has been tasked by Gingrich. It says, Peter Hofstra, who attended 2 sessions, has evidently been on a strategy doctrine function in the House, and as I understood it, to expand it to the Senate as well. Hofstra's office said the congressman went at the Speaker's request to try to learn how organizations like the Army deals with problem solving. Ron Foreman, spokesman for Jim Comey. Now, Jim Comey claims not to be really, he said in Colby's case, the invitation was to attend came from the Army and not from Gingrich.
So it's also looking at the organizational structure of the Army. When the Republicans...
it is to do something for the House before he...
It's to run the House like a military operation.
Before he was ever Speaker.
Okay. Thanks, caller. We'll get some reaction from our guest. Appreciate you passing that along, and we like that when you share with us stories that we have not seen here in Washington. So thank you.
Yeah, it's hard to tell from the description what that story is about, but it sounded like they were receiving training from the military on how to organize, I don't know, the Republican caucus or the House or something. I think it's an interesting story in the militarization of Congress.
By the way, the Speaker of the House is in Ireland. The dateline is Inch Island, Ireland. This is an AP story that said House Speaker Newt Gingrich dug into his rebellious Irish roots yesterday, an experience that he called far more emotional than I would have imagined. Mr. Gingrich and a congressional delegation are on an 8-day tour of Ireland and Northern Ireland and have held meetings with many of the parties in the new power-sharing assembly in the British-ruled province. By the way, the president will be in Ireland and Northern Ireland September 3rd, 4th, and 5th on his way back from Russia. He leaves for Russia on Monday, August 31st. Base in Wyoming is next from our moderate line. Good morning.
Good morning. I would like to make a comment and congratulate Gary on his book.
Thanks.
I was born in the late 40s. My own dad was a career Army person. My stepdad was Navy. And, you know, I just feel like the CIA answers to no one. And it's about time somebody took them to task regardless. And they have had strange bedfellows for years.
Yeah, and that's sort of the tragedy of all this is that, and one of the points that the Esquire piece makes is how there is a long record of CIA involvement with suspected drug traffickers and drug trafficking organizations. And this is a history that's mostly unknown to the American public. What I tried to do, and I think we could have done it better in the original series, was show that this situation involving the Contras in Los Angeles dealing dope to the gangs was not an isolated incident. It wasn't an aberration. There have been reports of CIA involvement with drug traffickers all the way back to the secret war in Laos. There's a whole book written by Professor Alfred McCoy called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, which the CIA actually went to court and tried to prevent from being printed back in the 70s, about the CIA's involvement with Laotian drug traffickers. And here was, you know, this story, I think, showed what happens when you get in bed with those kind of people. The results are sometimes unintended, and I think in this case, this was a case, you know, this stuff happens so often, the CIA has a word for it, it's called blowback. It's what happens when you do something overseas that comes back and blows up in the face of the American public. And in the case of the Contra War, you had a situation where we got in bed with drug traffickers. There was a story, which I frankly never thought I would see on the front page of the New York Times, I know it was July 17th, in which the Times reported that the CIA now admits that they had relationships with about 24 drug traffickers during the Contra War, and continued the relationships even after being told that there was evidence these men were trafficking drugs.
By the way, if you can't get through on our phone lines and want to fax us a question during the course of the morning, our number 202-393-3347. That's 393-3347, and we'll take your faxes throughout the morning. You can also email us. Our address on the internet is www.cspan.org, and our email address is journal@cspan.org. An email for you from a viewer in San Diego who says, in the course of your research, what, if anything, did you learn about the following? Number 1, Oliver North's contemptuous knowledge of Contras smuggling drugs into the U.S. Number 2, drugs being flown from the CIA, from Central America to U.S. military bases under CIA protection. Do you think anyone will ever be held accountable for these crimes? Thanks for your courageous work.
Well, the first question on what Oliver North knew about it, one of the sources I used in preparing the book were his diaries that were produced during the Iran-Contra investigation. And it's very clear. The Washington Post did a story on this when he ran for Senate a couple of years ago on all the drug-related entries that were in North's diaries. He was clearly getting information from his people in Central America that the Contras and a number of the organizations we were supporting down there were engaged in drug trafficking. The Post story raised a very good question as to what did North do with this information. North says he turned it over to the DEA. The DEA said we never got anything. One of the chapters in my book, I talk about an incident involving an investigation by a U.S. Customs informant in Costa Rica. He was looking into allegations that the DEA office in Costa Rica was protecting Contra drug labs along the border. The chapter is essentially about how North was able to get the evidence that this informant dug up down in Costa Rica, and how this evidence was destroyed by one of North's aides, which it made the Iran-Contra report, but a very tiny little segment in the back, and I expanded on this in the book for a whole chapter. The second question about drugs being flown from Central America to U.S. military bases, this was evidence that we found in a court file in Nicaragua. There was a drug case down there in 1992 in which a government witness said that this drug ring was using a military base in El Salvador and loading cocaine on Salvadoran military aircraft, and these aircraft were flying into an air base near Fort Worth, Texas, and unloading. I could not corroborate that because all the flight records from that period had been destroyed by the Air Force. But there was testimony to that effect in a court case in Nicaragua.
And more details outlined in Gary Webb's new book called Dark Alliance. As we continue with your phone calls, he'll be with us for another 15 to 20 minutes. Flatwood, West Virginia, on our conservative line. Good morning.
Good morning. My husband was in the Navy, and he had to do a tour on land, unfortunately, in Vietnam. He was in ordnance. Head ordnance man. He said this never happened with CNM's item that came out. He says, if anything, people should have gone directly to the ordnance man and asked them the question in Vietnam and on the ships out at sea. He says there was nothing with any kind of chemicals that went out there except for gas. That was it, kind of, stinking stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But nothing in nerve agent, nothing in any kind of chemicals that would kill anybody. And I have a question to ask you. I'd like to know what's in the Post, because I get most of my information from your station, thank God. The Post from back east about the president and whatever. And another station was talking about it, and they were saying how, I guess it was a little lethal, but I would like to get that information.
Well, the Washington Post and the New York Times both have a story that we spent a little bit of time talking about earlier. Essentially, what is the definition of sex? Is that a fair
I think
assessment?
that's a very fair statement of
This is the headline: President weighs admitting he had sexual contacts. The narrow definition would explain an earlier denial, and we'll go inside in just a moment to give you some more insight into what they said. Did you want to respond to the caller?
Yeah, I think the thing that surprised me about that story that I had not heard before is that when Clinton was responding to these questions about did you have sexual contact, he was doing so after being given a definition of what sexual contact was. And this was a definition that had been worked out by Paula Jones's lawyers. And, like you said, we don't want to get into it on family television, but when you realize this is an important story because everybody thinks that Clinton was just asked a question and responded to it off the cuff, when actually he was responding to a question that was very tightly drawn by the attorneys in the Paula Jones case. So you can read that, again, like anything that's written by a lawyer, you can read it a couple of ways, but I think it's an important thing to know.
And in fact, the front page of the Washington Times, just below the fold, takes a look at that deposition, which took place on January 17th, and over the course of the next couple of days, you will likely hear a lot of discussion on what exactly the president said in the Paula Corbin Jones case, a case which we should also point out has since been thrown out. Paula Jones, by the way, is also in the news on another issue, which we'll talk about in a moment. But let me show our viewers. He said 267 times, I don't remember, I don't know, I'm not sure, I have no idea, I don't believe so, I have no recollection, I can't say, I can't remember, to the best of my knowledge, I honestly don't remember, that's all I know, I just don't know, I really don't know, I can't deny that, I have no memory of that at all.
Well, I don't know if that tops Ed Meese's record before the Iran-Contra committees. I think Meese had it 300 times or so.
And Paula Jones in the news. We'll show the pictures to our viewers, the before and after. This, according to Names and Faces in the Washington Post. It's also in the New York Times, USA Today, and probably in your hometown paper as well. She had a nose job, plastic surgery.
All right. That's fine.
There's an even bigger picture this morning in the Washington Times. It's called Paula's New Look, and the picture is from ABC.
I like it, don't you? I like her new look.
I'm going to go on to another call. Key West, Florida. Good morning on our liberal line.
Good morning.
Hello.
Oh, hello. Good morning. I'd like to draw a parallel between the author's book, Dark Alliance, and a previous book written in 1972 called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia by Pulitzer Prize winner Alfred W. McCoy. And he details U.S. government involvement in the drug trade all the way from before the Boxer Rebellion through Lucky Luciano's release from prison to reorganize the Corsican Syndicate and its the CIA involvement in Vietnam. The other point I had is regarding this Lewinsky thing. I think that it mainly draws media attention away from issues that really matter, such as pollution, overpopulation, the greenhouse effect on down, and sort of a smokescreen, really.
Well, you've got to understand the media to understand why this is such a great story. It's titillating. It sells newspapers, and it's a very easy story to do. You don't have to do a lot of work. These are handout stories. You go to the president's people, they give you their spin. You go to Ken Starr's people, they give you their spin. You go back and write it up. And at the end of the day, you've really, you've illuminated no one, but you've titillated a lot of people. And so that's why sex scandals are such great stories for reporters, because they're easy to do. Stories like the greenhouse effect, stories about, I think one of the biggest stories going today is the South Africa Truth Commission. They just had the hearings regarding this incredible program they had there called Project Coast, which I've read very little about in the American press. It's mostly been on the foreign wire services. That is a remarkable story of modern-day evil at its worst, but you haven't read anything about it because, we've got 3,000 reporters assigned to the Monica Lewinsky story.
There's also the case in Burma with the 6 or 8 American students who were charged with passing out leaflets in a pro-democracy activity. Some of the students, 4 from American University here in Washington. The trial is taking place today. Are you following that?
Yeah, that's another story you've heard very little about. And I think, it's just a matter of news priorities. And unfortunately, foreign events don't interest us that much anymore. I mean, you used to see, I started in the business in '78, and I've seen a really significant decline in foreign news and this sort of fixation with the sex lives of politicians.
Martha Moore has a piece this morning in USA Today looking at the media's role in all of this. She begins this way: like a good son, Dennis Ryerson, who is the editor of the Des Moines Register, called his mother last week. She gave him an earful. She said, "Your father is so sick of Monica and Bill, he says he's not going to read one more word about it." Ryerson says, "I had to tell her, Mom, we just decided to put the story on top of page 1 tomorrow." The story continues by saying, with the Lewinsky investigation and all of its legal twists, it's still being followed intensely by millions of Americans, creating television figures such as CNBC's Chris Matthews and Geraldo Rivera, CNN's Bob Franken, and MSNBC's Keith Olbermann.
I know Dennis Ryerson. He used to work at the Cleveland Plain Dealer with me, and he's a very thoughtful journalist. I'm sure that if he had his druthers, he would not be putting this on the top of page 1.
Denver, good morning on our moderate line.
Good morning. I was calling about the comparison between the CNN Tailwind story and Gary Webb story, which I've been following. I saw the interview he did with Gil Noble in New York a couple of weeks back. In fact, I'm looking at it right now, the transcript of it. The thing that concerned me, that disturbed me the most about the Floyd Abrams report in the Tailwind scandal was the degree to which it seemed like a lot of the errors to me that were committed by CNN were committed by editorial people, and yet the Floyd Abrams report virtually ignores that side of the story. And my question for Mr. Webb was, before the Mercury News backed off of your story, did you find that your editors helped you make the story be a better story, or did you find that they were partly responsible for some of the misinterpretations that later came out about it?
That's a good question. One of my favorite lines was when I would submit a story to my editors, and I was in the bureau about 150 miles from the main office, so you would send it up over your computer modem. I would hit the transmit button and say it's all downhill from here. I think, you know, I'm biased, obviously. I'm a reporter, and there's a constant conflict between reporters and editors. But in the case of the Tailwind story, I thought it was significant that the producers of that show asked for an hour. And to me, if you're going to accuse the United States government of gassing our own citizens, an hour doesn't seem like too much to ask to air this story. They got 18 minutes. And the criticisms in the Abrams report were consistently over things that were left out. Now, in my case, it was very similar. I mean, I had turned in a series that was 4 parts originally. It was cut to 3, and a lot of the things that we were criticized for not reporting were things that actually had been reported initially and were cut out to save space. And I think, you know, that's a problem. If you're going to do serious investigative journalism and you're going to do stories implicating the government in essentially crimes of state, you shouldn't be worried about, well, should we have 18 minutes or should we have an hour? You should give these reporters the time they need to do the story right. And I think a lot of these problems we're seeing would not appear.
Michael Kramer, who is the executive editor of this publication, Brill's Content, will be our guest Sunday. And on page 115 is the Q&A looking at the CNN nerve gas retraction. And we'll be talking to him for about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. That's Sunday on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, which gets underway at 8 o'clock East Coast time. Ridgewood, New Jersey is next on our conservative line. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Mr. Webb, I was wondering if you have ever gotten a chance to look into the rumors and reports that Mena, Arkansas was a major drug transshipment center during the 80s. I think that's been reported by Micah Morrison of the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and I think Emmett Terrell's also touched on this issue.
We also have an email from a viewer who asked the same question from Encino, California. What have you uncovered about Mena, Arkansas, and the Bush-Clinton involvement?
Yeah, the Mena story takes up about a chapter in my book, and the reason I included it was because what was going on in Mena, Arkansas during the 1980s was very similar to what was going on in Los Angeles with this Contra drug ring. For those people who don't know, there was a major drug trafficker named Barry Seal who was based his air fleet at Mena, which is a tiny little airport up in the mountains of Arkansas. And drugs were coming into the country. Seal was one of the biggest traffickers in the southeast of the United States during those years. And there were lots of rumors that he was flying guns south. And Micah Morrison from the Wall Street Journal really has been the only reporter to treat this as a serious issue and to actually do some investigation. There had been a story that was done a couple of years ago by Roger Morris and Sally Denton, initially for the Washington Post, called The Crimes of Mena, which took a look at Seal's personal records and drew a very chilling story about how law enforcement investigations into this drug ring and this money laundering operation were quashed. The Washington Post refused to run the story eventually, and it appeared in Penthouse magazine. But this is another story that the national media has sort of blown off as some wacko conspiracy theory. 2 weeks before my series appeared, the CIA Inspector General issued a report, which is still classified if I'm not mistaken, but the results were leaked to the press, and it said the CIA admitted that it had a presence at this air base in Mena. It admitted that it had done repairs of aircraft at this air base in Mena. And this is a story that sort of came and went. I mean, Jim Leach's banking committee was supposed to have done an investigation. It may have actually done one, and I don't think those reports have ever been released, or his findings have ever been released.
If you've just joined us, we're talking with Gary Webb, who is the author of Dark Alliance. His father was a Marine officer, so you grew up throughout most of the country, right. I understand. Began his journalistic career in Kentucky at the Kentucky Post and also the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Spent 9 years in San Jose working for the Mercury News and has a new book out called Dark Alliance, and is also working on another publication. By the way, I want to follow up on an earlier call who had commented about an editorial that was written by a member of Congress, and I believe it was a former member of Congress, a Democrat, Ben Jones from Georgia, who served from 1989 to 1993, the former Hollywood actor, and he wrote in yesterday's roll call, "Mr. President, do the right thing and step down. So a follow-up to the previous caller who phoned in. This was used last night on either MSNBC or on CNBC's Geraldo program. New York City is next on our liberal line. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Yes, I've been calling about several things. What I'm interested in finding out, if you can, first of all, the Taliban was also part of the CIA cooperation, I believe. And I think the MENA thing, these are peripheral things that I'm just going to mention. The only interest people have in that is so that they can assign the blame to Clinton. They're not so much interested in the use of the airport for drug trafficking as they are to see if they can find another thing to tie onto his tail. My own purpose in calling is to really ask why there has been such a blackout of any information about Mr. Scaife. There have been no investigative reports. The newspapers are not interested in discussing it. There's been, it seems to me, my own conspiracy theory is that there really is a right-wing conspiracy to try to make sure that the Democratic Party is really defanged, destroyed, and the result of that will be that they can get what they're really after, which is the New Deal. It just seems to me that the same old enemies have gotten together with a lot of money. A lot of reporters are certainly in the loop. Many of them admit that they have been on the receiving end of help. The newspapers are now owned by right-wing owners, and the purpose is to get at public education, to get at the medical services to the poor, to get at erasing the environmental laws. Best way to do it is to make people so sick and tired of voting that no one...
We had lost that call. I'm sorry to the caller, and I apologize. That was my mistake. I inadvertently did hit the button. But you asked about Richard Mellon Scaife, and so I'll follow up and ask you to respond to the caller's comment. And again, I apologize.
I think that's a good question, and I believe that's who Hillary Clinton was referring to when she talked about this vast right-wing conspiracy to tar the president. Scaife is a very interesting figure in American journalism, and you know, when I was looking for stories about him, I saw a piece, I think it was the Columbia Journalism Review many years ago, that was a very definitive look at who Richard Mellon Scaife was. And I think it's good to look at the people who own the media. And I think I think Scaife has sort of gone unexamined. But it was, you know, there was that David Hale story for a while down in Arkansas where they talked about the American Spectator and possibly money being paid for people to become witnesses in the Paula Jones case. And Scaife got a brief mention in the media as a result of those things, and then the story just went away. And a lot of people laughed about Hillary Clinton saying a vast right-wing conspiracy, but I think there's something there worth looking at, and that's who owns the media and how much of it sort of reflects their ideological bent.
So you agree with the caller's argument?
I agree that it's an issue worth exploring, definitely, and the press has done a really rotten job of.
An email from John Andraco. I am appalled that you would have Gary Webb on your program. There he sits mouthing anti-government garbage about how Tailwind was stopped and how the question is still open as to what happened. He has no business on a credible program with his bias against the government. He must be a product of his times and a typical California nut. There have been too many investigations into the drug charges to have his idea promoted as truth. The moderator sat there, referring to me, and questioned him as though he believed this nonsense about Tailwind. Unbelievable for C-SPAN.
Well, I think as a reporter, you've got to have some sort of an anti-government look at it to cover them fairly. If you're pro-government, who needs you? My view is that when you're a reporter, you're supposed to be reporting things the government doesn't want you to report, not the things the government wants you to report. They have millions of people on the payroll who are happy to tell you all the great things that our government is doing for us, and that's fine, but it's not the press's job to be cheerleaders for the government.
Gary Webb with us for another 10 minutes or so, and then later we'll take you to Detroit, where the C-SPAN school bus is parked, and talk to a couple of reporters from the two newspapers in that town. Long Island, New York, good morning on our moderate line.
Good morning. Am I on?
You sure are.
You know, I just heard this gentleman say that a reporter could be you're either anti or pro-government. I don't think you should be either. I think that what you should do is examine that statement, sir.
Well, in fairness to him, I don't think that's what he said.
Being labeled anti-government, you know, when you're an investigative reporter, you're out to uncover wrongdoing, essentially. And if you go into the job believing that everything the government tells you is true, you're not going to be very good at what you do. And unfortunately, a lot of reporters these days are not reporters as much as they are stenographers. And they go to the government, they write down what the government tells them, and then they go back and put it into the paper without really examining it. So to be accused of being anti-government, I don't think is all that much of an epithet, frankly.
Am I on still?
You sure are.
Oh.
I told you I'd give you equal time.
I've been around a long time. I'm 73 years old, and I've done my stint in German prison camps and things like that. I've seen what the press and what certain people tried to say never happened, the Holocaust. I walked right past it myself, Mr. Eisenhower did. I can see what the press can do. I can see how the press can take a statement and blow it up. I can see how they're turning around now and trying to define sex. The man had sex. Everything that they say about what he did is true. It's just a bunch of lawyers trying to play games with the English language. I don't understand at all what's going on here. How an intelligent person like you or people of your age group can stay with a man like this who's double-crossed labor. He got our vote. We voted for him. He turns around, he signs NAFTA, which is going to put us down the tubes. We're losing jobs like crazy in this country. And in 25 years, my grandchildren, if they can't go to college and become some kind of a scientist or something, they won't be able to get a job. We don't have anything left in this country.
Thanks, Carl.
Everything this man has done has been to put this country down.
Thanks for the caller from Long Island, New York.
Well, you know, one of the comments he made was how the press is trying to split hairs on what sex is. The press isn't doing anything but reporting the spin of the Clinton office in this case. It's not the press that's doing it. I mean, the press is covering the story, obviously, but it isn't coming up with these, I agree, with these harebrained explanations of what sex is and what it isn't. So
Let me go back to the New York Times story again. This is the front page, which outlines in great detail what is sex according to what the lawyers have defined. But there's also a quote from Ann Lewis, who is the White House Communications Director. On January 25th, she appeared on the Fox News program. Quote, sex is sex, maybe only in Washington is this considered something we ought to spend a lot of time on. But no, a sexual relationship means what it says, and that includes sex. The story goes on to say, in Mr. Clinton's practice sessions, his advisors and his lawyers are questioning him and designing answers that allow him to acknowledge a relationship with Ms. Lewinsky without going into any graphic detail.
That's a big difference between saying I never had sexual relations with a woman and now saying, well, we had a limited sexual relationship. What did Nixon call that, the limited hangout route during Watergate?
Murfreesboro, Tennessee, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Mr. Webb, I'm curious if you're familiar with a book called Spite House, S-P-I-T-E, by Monica Jensen Stevenson. A friend of mine, she wrote the book about a friend of mine and Bobby Garwood, one of the only, I think, servicemen who was actually convicted of defecting during the Vietnam War. And one of the things, in one of the chapters they discuss in there was related to the use, or let's say the service going after defectors, not necessarily the use of nerve gas, but certainly in a vicious way to take care of them without due process. And of course, all of us know that sometimes under the UCMJ, that due process is often set aside. I mean, it's a way that the service deals with things. So I'm just curious if you're familiar with that book at all.
Yeah, I have not read it, but I'm familiar with the book you're talking about. And I believe Garwood was on a national radio program the other day talking about what had happened to him. And I did not hear the show, but it was described to me that the other guest on the show was a military officer who had been sent to kill him. So, you know, what you're saying is not outside of the realm of possibility. I mean, defectors were treated very badly. And you know, if he was an actual defector, I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't be too sorry about that.
Another email, Mr. Webb earlier pointed out that the media loves covering an easy, sexy story ad nauseum. Sad but true, our media now mirrors the ugly Fleet Street type of yellow journalism from jolly old England. I find it disturbing that a special prosecutor has been questioning American citizens concerning the sex life of our president. Welcome to the age of the sex police. It has only just begun. Many others on Capitol Hill have skeletons in their closets. Such fodder for the American mind. We get a call from Flagler Beach, Florida. Good morning on our liberal line.
Good morning. Mr. Webb, you were saying that you like to write some books. I have a suggestion you might want to consider. I was paying attention for a while about how many military aircraft were going down. If you were to check the last 3 years alone, you'll be astounded and flabbergasted at the amount of airplanes throughout the world, United States military airplanes, helicopters, that have crashed. There are, I got up to 65, just with my narrow way of finding out. I think you're going to find billions and billions of dollars and hundreds of pilots, and it's not being, nobody's checking on this. You can also check in that book, if you were interested in writing a book, about how the industry, private industry, is stealing away our talented pilots. I have a friend who has 2 sons who were jet pilots, and they were on aircraft carrier Navy pilots, and they went to Iraq, and they became, what do you call them, experimental training. And they're astronauts right now. They're twin brothers, and they're both astronauts. But they were offered a fortune by private industry, and it cost $1 million each to train these guys. But the thing I think should be looked into is why and how many of these aircraft, military aircraft, are crashing. Just a suggestion. You might want to consider that. Bye-bye.
I think actually a reporter a couple of years ago won a Pulitzer Prize for a story, and I think it was military helicopters, if I'm not mistaken, how often they were crashing. So, I mean, you've got a point.
Florida City, Florida, on our moderate line. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I was a smuggler out of Miami from 1967 to 1983.
What did you smuggle?
I smuggled pot out of Colombia and Jamaica.
And why did you do it?
Well, because it made a lot of money.
How much did you make?
For the money, of course, and the action and the fun. But anyway,
hold on. How did you do it? Obviously, you flew, but
well, first we used to use sailboats in the early '60s, and then we switched over to for freighters and stuff till about the early '70s.
Oh, so you didn't fly?
Huh?
You didn't fly. You used a boat.
Then we switched over to airplanes, and we used airplanes. I used airplanes up until about ¡83 when I was captured.
How much money did you make?
Huh?
How much money did you make?
Oh, I don't know. We made a few millions of it.
And what are you doing now?
Ben Kramer was the last people I was involved in. That was one of the biggest seizures in the history of this country. But anyway, let's talk about the CIA.
Well, one last question, and then I'll let you. What are you doing today?
Oh, I'm retired.
Retired from drug smuggling.
I did 10 years of probation and time. And it was all right. But anyhow, it was very interesting because I have connections with Nicaragua because my father was part of the landing crew that captured and executed the Santino brothers that they named the Sandinistas after. But anyhow, what I want to talk about is the CIA connection with drugs. See, my competitor were the Cubans, and the Cuban connections with the CIA are legendary.
Right.
And I was wondering if he had any story about. Well, right now they're about ready to turn over Homestead Air Force Base to this group of people I used to be my competitors with, Latin Builders Association, the Cuban organization. But anyhow, I was kind of curious about. In 1988, I lost a D-18 and went on a one-way trip to Costa Rica to haul, canvas and beads and stuff for them, and I never got the plane back. It just kind of went down there, and I believe they probably loaded it with dope and took it to California. The next time I saw it was Miami Vice. It was out there flying on the TV program. But anyhow, I was kind of curious if you ever found out and knew anything about any connection between the Cubans and the CIA with drugs, because I thought that was a pretty big story, and the head godfather, Jorge Mascanosa, just died.
We'll get a response. Thank you, caller from Florida City.
There was a lot of questions. I'll try to remember them all. Yeah, there was a very heavy Cuban presence in the Contra organizations down in Costa Rica that were involved in drug smuggling. There was actually a company called Frigoríficos de Punta Arenas that was based in Costa Rica. It was a shrimp importing company that was owned by Cuban-American drug smugglers, and they had a State Department contract to haul supplies to the Contras. So you're right. I mean, there was a very heavy Cuban presence down there, and I'm trying to remember some of the other questions he had about.
The caller's not with us now, but I was intrigued by his own background and wondering how many of those type of drug smugglers there are or were in the time that you did your research?
There were dozens of them. There were dozens of them. And you know, one of the things he mentioned about losing an aircraft, I interviewed a former CIA pilot in Florida named Ronald Lippert, who leased one of his aircraft to this Contra organization, and it wound up in Mexico being seized by the Mexican police with like 2,500 pounds of pot on it. So, I mean, it's a situation that happened time and time again during the Contra War.
Briefly, can you explain how it worked for a pilot like this, or the operator of a boat, to get the drugs from South or Central America and bring it back? What
they were doing in this one particular drug ring that's in the book was they were flying it up through from Colombia to Costa Rica or to El Salvador. It would be offloaded from smaller planes onto either military aircraft in San Salvador, or it would be flown up, and in that case they would be taken to this base outside of Fort Worth. At least that's what the evidence suggested. In other cases, they would load him on, like he said, Colombian freighters, and in the case of this drug ring, it was the Grand Colombiana line, and they would ply the waters off the coast of California and Oregon and Seattle, and go into these ports and literally dump cocaine overboard, and frogmen would swim it ashore, and that gave one of the famous cases in California that I write about in the book is called the Frogman case, and it was the biggest drug seizure in California history. Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion. By the way, there's also a foreword by a California Congresswoman, Maxine Waters. Why did she write the start of the book? Well, because this impacted most heavily in her district in south central Los Angeles, and she has been the leading congressional advocate for an official investigation. I mean, essentially right now we've had investigations done by the suspects, the CIA, the Justice Department, and she's pushing for a quote-unquote real investigation by an outside agency or an outside body. A few more minutes with our guest. Louisville is next on our conservative line. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. I have 2 points I'd like to make with regards to the Clinton problems that are in the media right now. I've seen presidents since Harry Truman's day, all right? That makes me a little older than you two fellas. But I can tell you this, that this gentleman we have as president now is the most grossly immature man we've ever had in the office, and I think that is unquestionably so. Second, we hear a lot of people calling in and complaining about the partisanship of Mr. Starr. I'd like to remind everybody that there's a gentleman working with Mr. Starr by the name of Samuel Dash. And if I remember my history correctly, Samuel Dash was a Democratic counsel to Sam Ervin on the Watergate Committee, and he was instrumental in bringing Richard Nixon down. Now, if this is such a partisan investigation, why are well, not most of them, but why are some of the prosecutors Democrat, and why is Mr. Dash, in fact, working with Mr. Starr?
Thanks, caller. Gary Webb?
I don't know the answer to that, other than that, you know, prosecutors are prosecutors. I don't think most of them, by and large, are particularly partisan, although there's a lot of evidence of partisanship by Ken Starr. There are 2 Nixon references that I want to bring to our viewers' attention. First, Jack Germond and Jules Woodcover in the Baltimore Sun. Syndicated columnists have a piece, The Nixon Tapes, Cutting Up History at a Price. Under court order, and you may have read about this recently, the National Archives had begun cutting out 820 of the 3,700 hours of tapes to excise what have been characterized as private conversations of Richard Nixon with various individuals during the period after the 1972 Watergate break-in and cover-up. John Carlin, who's the archivist at of the U.S., says he entertains the hope that the Nixon estate at some point may agree to make public some of the conversations on political matters now classified as personal or private. But waiting for that to happen is about as likely as waiting for Nixon to admit guilt at the time or later in the Watergate cover-up. Yeah, this is another instance where our history is being controlled by other people. I think whatever on those tapes belongs to the American public. I mean, Nixon's privacy rights died when he did. Paul Jagot in the Wall Street Journal has a column called Potomac Watch, and he says Woodward and Bernstein lose their fastball. The big reason I got into journalism was Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. As a college reporter, I cheered their zealous pursuit of Watergate and all the president's men. But it seems the years have given the pair second thoughts about holding politicians accountable under the law. Or so I conclude from their views about presidential scandal expressed Sunday on NBC's Meet the Press. Mr. Bernstein, the legendary rebel, now sides with the White House establishment. Mr. Woodward was more balanced, but he still embraced Mr. Bernstein's new proportionality standard, at least for President Clinton.
Paul Jagot goes on to say that Mr. Bernstein now says that the Clinton scandal is merely about a private consensual sexual matter that bears no resemblance to Watergate.
You know, I was at a convention of investigative reporters a couple years back, and Seymour Hersh was one of the keynote speakers, you know, the semi-legendary investigative reporter formerly of the New York Times. And this was not too long after Clinton had been elected, and Hersh got up and said, Clinton's big problem is he cannot tell the truth. And this was long before Whitewater, and it was long before Lewinsky. And I thought back to that today when we talk about how Clinton's waffling on this and waffling on that. Some reporters have known this for years.
Denver is next on our liberal line. Good morning.
Hello.
Hello, you're on the air.
Yeah, it's John from Denver. And I just wanted to say that I really believe that since the Kennedy assassination, the whole governmental climate, i.e. United States, with the press and everything, has been manipulated and has changed to the point where the situation we see today, which actually has no merit or bearing on the lives of a common person such as myself as a single parent or my friends, is way out of control. And I applaud Mr. Webb, not being a California nut or whatever the heck he was, but I think it's important for people such as himself to bring out the points of how things are actually working underneath the seamy underbelly of our society. And that's all I'm going to say. And I love Washington Journal, and keep up the good work. And Mr. Webb, I can't wait to buy your book.
Well, thanks.
Annapolis is next. Good morning.
Hi, how you doing there?
Fine, thanks.
I was just listening to your program this morning, and I wanted to say to Mr. Webb, a couple of people come to mind when you talk about the CIA and drugs. Henry B. Gonzalez, when he was in the House of Representatives, Noriega, George Bush, when he was director of the CIA, Bill Bennett as a drug czar, and I also read a lot of Noam Chomsky, and so I don't really think you're that far off the mark, sir. There's compelling evidence to support your theory.
Well, if you look at the book, I've got 70 pages of source notes. Like I said, like the series, most of the book is based on the government's own documents and the testimony of government witnesses. Now, you can argue that, well, this wasn't official CIA policy, which a lot of people have argued. I will point out that at the House Intelligence Committee hearings in March, the Inspector General of the CIA, Frederick Hitz, disclosed that there had been an agreement signed in 1982 between the director of the CIA, William Casey, and the former Attorney General, William French Smith, which allowed the CIA not to have to report incidents of drug trafficking by its agents and its assets. And I think, you know, that sort of eliminates the question as to who knew what when you've got the chief law enforcement officer of this country and its top intelligence official agreeing, sort of making a gentleman's agreement that the CIA doesn't have to tell the Justice Department when its agents and assets are drug trafficking. You've got a serious problem there. And I think the most shocking thing to me and to the members of the Congressional Committee was the fact that this agreement stayed in effect until 1995. So you had 13 years there where the CIA did not have to report drug trafficking by its people.
How long has the book been out?
It's been out approximately a month and a half.
And the reaction?
The reaction has been very favorable. I mean, even the Washington Post, which is a very strident critic of the series, gave it a fairly positive review last Sunday.
And where will this all lead? What's going to happen as a result of this book?
Well, I'm not sure anything will happen unless Congress has the will to lift these rocks up and look under them. And the last serious investigation we've had of the CIA happened during the Pike Committee and the Church Committee in the 70s, and the agency took decades to recover from those. I'm not sure Congress has the will to look at what they've been doing since then.
And finally, based on some of the calls and what you have alluded to in the last hour or so with the CIA, have you had any reaction from the government, from the CIA, or anyone involved in what you have been investigating as a result of this book?
Well, like I said, the CIA has finally gotten around to admitting what a lot of people knew back in the 80s, that a lot of the Contras were drug traffickers and they didn't do anything about it. And I think that's a giant step forward when we talk about, you know, being accountable and having accountability to the public.
But you personally?
Oh, well, I lost my job at the newspaper. I'm not sure the CIA had anything to do with that, but, I mean, the repercussions on myself. And my partner in Nicaragua was getting serious death threats. He finally had to leave the country.
The book is called Dark Alliance. Our guest for the last hour and 15 minutes has been Gary Webb. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.